He was stopped by two police officers due to a vague report of a suspicious individual. Their expressions, their tone, everything about them was steeped in judgment and bias. He tried to maintain his composure, relying on his civil rights and responding calmly. But his calm demeanor only seemed to fuel their aggression. The insults began to fly, targeting his skin color and implying his inferiority in their eyes. They refused to tolerate any defiance, even in the mildest form. To them, he was nothing more than a stubborn black man who needed to be taught a lesson. Then the worst happened. In front of a crowd of shocked onlookers, he was forcefully restrained. The sharp sound of handcuffs tightening around his wrists echoed in the air. A successful, respectable man was now treated like a dangerous criminal in public. The officers took pride in their actions, believing they had accomplished something significant by teaching him a lesson. Little did they know, they had made a grave mistake. They had no idea who they had just insulted and handcuffed. What explosive secrets are about to surface? What dire consequences await the two officers? And will justice be served when the truth comes to light? Stay tuned for this gripping story to uncover the answers. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on the next meaningful stories. We have another impactful story coming your way tomorrow. As the night settled over Chicago, the United Airlines plane made a smooth descent onto runway 28 at O'Hare International Airport. Elias Vance exhaled softly, a small but significant gesture of relief after a nearly 4-hour flight from Washington, D.C. His unscheduled trip to a high-security conference in Europe had dragged on longer than anticipated, and all he now craved was the peace that could only be found at home, away from his demanding schedule. He waited patiently for the seatbelt sign to turn off and the plane to reach gate B12. At nearly 60 years old, Elias still maintained the tall, lean build of a man who had spent much of his life in law enforcement and intelligence. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his face weathered, but his eyes remained sharp, calm, and instinctively observant. He wore a well-fitted, understated suit, with his dark blue tie loosened from a long flight. His appearance exuded quiet professionalism and authority without being overly conspicuous, a skill honed through years of working in both the shadows and the public eye. He carried only a black leather briefcase containing classified documents and a small bag for personal items. There was no entourage, no visible security detail. This was how he preferred to travel on unofficial or sensitive trips, without attracting attention in public places. Airports, with their bustling crowds and potential chaos, are always high-stakes environments, even for the head of the country's most powerful investigative agency. As the plane doors opened, Vance joined the flow of passengers disembarking. He pulled his small bag behind him, his briefcase held firmly under his arm, walking at a steady pace. His eyes, a trained reflex, scanned the surroundings, noting faces, gestures, abandoned items, an automatic instinct to assess the environment and detect any anomalies. The terminal's waiting area was crowded, even late in the afternoon, with flight announcements echoing through loudspeakers, the sound of suitcase wheels rolling across the floor, and voices of all kinds filling the air. Vance kept a distance from the crowd, quietly heading toward the transfer area to catch his next flight back to D.C. He had no checked baggage, a habit that saved him time and reduced risk. Meanwhile, nearby at Gate B12, two officers from the Chicago Police Department were patrolling the airport. Officer Gary Peterson, a white man in his 50s with a face etched by fatigue and frustration, leaned against a pillar, half-heartedly observing the passing crowds. Beside him stood Officer Ryan Hayes, a younger man in his 30s, also white, exuding youthful energy but lacking the confidence that comes with experience. Peterson muttered about long shifts and low pay. Having worked this job for years, he had grown jaded and cynical. His racial and class biases were so deeply ingrained that he often used security checks as an opportunity to vent his personal frustrations on those he considered out of place or suspicious. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie on Peterson's shoulder crackled, then fell silent. only to be replaced by a message flashing on his handheld device. It was a report from an airport security officer about a suspicious person seen moving through Gate B12. The description was extremely vague. A male, black, wearing dark clothes, appearing nervous, walking alone. There were no specific behaviors outlined, no signs of wrongdoing, just a gut feeling of suspicion based on superficial details. Peterson skimmed through the message, a smirk slowly curling across his tired face. His eyes swept over the crowd spilling out from Gate B12 and immediately landed on Elias Vance, the only black man in sight who fit that vague description. "Hey, Ryan." Peterson nudged his younger partner. "Looks like we've got our guy, just as described." There was a touch of pride in his voice. Hayes followed Peterson's gaze and saw Vance walking calmly. He hesitated for a moment. The man appeared perfectly ordinary, even carrying himself with a sense of authority. But Peterson had more experience, and Hayes, still young and impressionable, followed orders and trusted his partner's judgment, even if it was colored by prejudice. "It fits," Hayes said uncertainly, trying to show he was alert too. Peterson didn't need more than that. He pushed himself away from the pillar, straightened his cap, and strolled toward Vance. His stride meant to project authority, but carrying an undercurrent of arrogance. They stopped Vance so suddenly that he almost tripped. "Sir, stop." Peterson's voice rang out, sharp and dismissive. Vance halted, turning to face the officers, his expression calm, with only a hint of annoyance in his eyes. He had been in this situation before, though not often in recent years, as his status had grown, but he knew well the feeling of being judged simply for the color of his skin. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was steady, controlled, clearly the voice of someone used to high-pressure situations. To Peterson, Vance's composure seemed like defiance. The older officer stepped closer, his gaze taking in Vance from head to toe, standing just a bit too close, his body language intended to exert pressure. "We have a report of a suspicious person matching your description in this area," Peterson said, his tone flat and matter-of-fact, as if it were an irrefutable truth. "Please show me your identification." Vance remained calm, though he wasn't about to comply without a valid reason. "What exactly does the report say, officer?" His voice was even, though with a sharp edge. "May I know what I'm being suspected of? I believe you need reasonable suspicion to stop and ask for a person's identification." He used legal terms casually, not to boast, but as a reminder of the limits of their authority. Peterson, clearly irritated by the precise wording and calm demeanor, scowled. He hated anyone who seemed to know the law, especially black people, whom he saw as inferior. "Don't ask so many questions," Peterson snapped, his impatience showing. "This is an airport. We have the right to search anyone. Just show your papers. Are you hiding something?" His eyes turned suspicious. Vance knew that continuing to argue about the law might only make the situation worse. He sighed quietly and slowly pulled his wallet from his jacket pocket, took out his Virginia driver's license, and handed it to Peterson. He knew the address in Virginia, far from Chicago, would likely only deepen the officer's suspicions. Peterson grabbed the license, glanced at the information, and then looked up at Vance with renewed contempt. "Elias Vance? All the way from Virginia?" he sneered. "What are you doing here in Chicago, dressed like you're heading to a meeting at the White House? You don't look like you're visiting family or on vacation." His tone was dripping with sarcasm and judgment. Officer Hayes, sensing the senior officer's authority, stepped forward, trying to appear sharp in his own way. "Or are you on some kind of mission? Transporting contraband? Tracking a target?" These unfounded speculations were based solely on Vance's skin color and his attire, combined with the vague report as a backdrop. Anger began to rise in Vance's chest. He had dedicated his life to serving this country, upholding the law and justice. And now, here he was being humiliated and unjustly accused by the very officers meant to protect those values. But years of experience and discipline kept him composed. Vance knew that losing his temper now would only play into their hands. "I'm on business," he replied, his voice calm but controlled. "And I repeat, my job and attire are none of your concern." There's no legitimate reason for you to stop me, question me like this, or make these insulting insinuations. Peterson let out a cruel laugh. Business trip? What kind of shady, secretive business are people like you involved in? The phrase people like you dripped with malice. It was clear that Peterson could no longer hide the deep racial prejudice in his words. This time, Vance couldn't stay silent. He locked eyes with Peterson, his gaze as cold as ice. "Officer," Vance said, his voice low but firm. "What you just said wasn't only inappropriate, it was outright discriminatory. I demand that you stop with this attitude and language immediately. Your conduct has crossed a line. You can't treat people like this." Being directly accused of discrimination by a black man was a blow to Peterson's already fragile ego. He snapped, his face turning red with rage. "When did I ever discriminate?" he shouted, swearing and switching to a more hostile, disrespectful tone. "You're the one who's under suspicion here. Don't lecture me. Who do you think you are?" Vance stood tall, unwavering in the face of Peterson's anger. "I'm a citizen of the United States, and I have the right to be free from harassment and abuse by law enforcement. I'm under no obligation to answer your irrelevant, personal questions. If you have no concrete evidence to arrest me, then please step aside and let me go." With that, he made a subtle move to step past them. This was the final straw for Peterson. Vance's action was a direct challenge to his authority. "You dare walk away?" Peterson yelled. "Resisting an officer? You must have something to hide." He turned to Hayes, his eyes signaling for action. "Get him. He could be armed. Restrain him." The lie was meant to justify the violence that was about to unfold. Hayes, momentarily unsure as he locked eyes with Vance, was swept up in Peterson's command and the rising tension. He instinctively obeyed, lunging forward to grab Vance's arm. But Vance, with reflexes honed by years of facing danger, reacted quickly, spinning away and swatting Hayes' arm aside. "Don't touch me," Vance shouted, the anger he'd held back finally breaking free. The self-defense move was immediately deemed as resistance by both officers. "See, he's resisting," Peterson yelled as he rushed to help Hayes. A brief but violent struggle ensued in the middle of the airport, causing a scene. Passengers scattered, some pulling out their phones to record the commotion. Though Vance was physically outmatched by the two younger, stronger officers, he knew that fighting back would only escalate the situation, putting him and others at greater risk. He tried to hold his ground, defending himself while also protesting their violence. But the officers' combined strength eventually overpowered him. They took him to the floor with force, briefly stunning him. His briefcase and bag fell, spilling some personal items onto the floor. Hayes, seizing the opportunity, grabbed a pair of handcuffs and twisted Vance's arms behind his back. The cold metal snapped tight around his wrists, sending a jolt of pain and numbness up his arms. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the overwhelming sense of humiliation and fury that surged through him. He was being treated like a criminal in public, simply for standing up for his rights in the face of injustice and racism. Peterson stood over him, panting with a crooked, triumphant smile. "See?" he sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I told you, stubborn, pretentious type. Now you'll have to be polite at the station." He bent down, mockingly holding up Vance's driver's license and stuffing it into his own pocket. "Let's see if you can keep your cool there." Vance gritted his teeth, trying to hold back a groan of frustration. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and gathered his composure. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun, and in the worst way possible. Two officers hoisted Vance up by his armpits. His expensive suit was now disheveled, the jacket askew and one knee of his trousers stained from the fall. But when his eyes opened, they weren't filled with fear or despair. They were cold and resolute, radiating an inner strength that made those around him uneasy, even though he was in such a vulnerable position. Peterson, still riding high on the power trip, leaned in closer, his voice dripping with malice, intent on humiliating the black man who had dared to oppose him. "Okay, Vance," Peterson sneered, emphasizing the name as if mocking it. "You think you're tough? Like to lecture cops on your rights? Now what? Who do you think you are, standing up to us? The question wasn't meant for an answer. It was a vicious challenge, an attempt to break Vance's spirit, to force him to submit. But Vance, despite his restraints and the pain, stood as straight as possible, looking Peterson directly in the eyes. His voice rang out clearly, oddly calm amidst the chaos, cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. I'm Elias Vance. The words were simple, direct, and devoid of any sign of submission. Peterson's smirk faltered, and his eyes narrowed with confusion. I know you're Vance. So what? He sneered. That name doesn't mean anything here. You're just a troublemaker. Vance remained silent, his eyes fixed coldly on Peterson. After a brief pause, he spoke again, each word deliberate, as if carving through the tension. Manager. There was a brief silence. Peterson and Hayes exchanged confused glances. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Vance continued, without hesitation, his voice steady. Director. Federal Bureau of Investigation. FBI. At those final words, the noise of the airport seemed to disappear. The bustling terminal, the clatter of suitcases, the chatter of passengers, all faded away as a deafening silence took over. The shock on the faces of Peterson and Hayes was palpable. The smirk on Peterson's face melted away, replaced by utter disbelief. His face turned ghostly pale, his eyes wide with terror, as if the man he had just humiliated had suddenly transformed into something unrecognizable. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and his mouth opened, but no coherent words came out. You said what? Peterson managed to stammer, his voice shaking. The director of the FBI, Vance repeated, his tone as calm as ever. Peterson staggered back, panic flooding his mind. He took an involuntary step back, his eyes filled with dread as he looked at Vance, now realizing the full extent of his mistake. Hayes, the younger officer, was equally stunned. His face drained of all color. His hands, which had been holding Vance's arm just moments ago, dropped to his sides. He stared at Vance, then at Peterson, then back at Vance, as the weight of what he had just participated in hit him. Oh, God, Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. No, it can't be. It can't be true. His legs buckled, his knees shaking, as he realized the gravity of the situation. The change in both officers' attitudes was swift and visible. What had been arrogance and aggression moments ago had now transformed into pure, unadulterated fear. The crowd around them, though they didn't know the full story, could sense that something extremely serious had just happened. Whispers spread, and the phones continued to record, capturing this dramatic moment for all to see. Peterson was the first to snap out of his stupor. Driven by fear for his career, his job, his freedom, he understood the terrible consequences of his actions. His thoughts raced, dominated by the fear of losing everything. Chat Danoi? He rushed toward Vance, nearly dropping to his knees, his voice completely changing as he became frantic, desperate, and pleading. Mr. Director, oh my God, please forgive me, Peterson stammered, his face ashen, sweat dripping down his brow. This is a terrible mistake. A huge mistake. We didn't know. We really didn't know who you were. He turned sharply to Hayes, still standing there, and barked, his voice trembling with panic. Hayes, you idiot! What are you doing just standing there? Take the handcuffs off. Take them off right now. Hurry. Do you want us both to end up in jail? Hayes jumped as if shocked by an electric current. Fumbling for the keys on his belt, his hands shook so violently that they slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. He bent down to retrieve them, his face blank with confusion, struggling to find the right key. After a few tense seconds of silence, he finally managed to unlock the cuffs. There was a dry click as the handcuffs slid off, releasing Vance's wrists, which were now deeply marked from the pressure. Through it all, Peterson continued to plead, his voice thick with remorse and desperation. We're so sorry, Director. The report, it was just so vague. We were just trying to do our job. Maybe we went too far. Please forgive us. Don't ruin our careers. We have families. Vance slowly raised both hands, gently rubbing the painful marks on his wrists. He said nothing. He didn't respond to their desperate pleas, nor did he express anger or forgiveness. He simply stood there, silently observing the two men with a cold, judgmental gaze. The silence emanating from the director of the FBI was far more terrifying than any threats or accusations. It was the calm before the storm. As the tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the officer's frantic pleas, a deep, steady, and authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "What the hell is going on here?" Lieutenant David Miller, a CPD officer on duty at O'Hare, strode quickly toward the scene. A white man in his early 40s with a serious and professional demeanor. Miller had likely heard about the disturbance over his radio, or perhaps a passenger had alerted him. He was accompanied by two other officers, ready to intervene if needed. As Miller assessed the scene, his gaze immediately took in the unusual situation. Vance, a black man in a suit with red, bruised wrists, stood facing Peterson and Hayes, who were visibly shaken, pale, sweating, and offering stammering, incoherent apologies. Miller may not have recognized Vance immediately, but it was clear enough that his two officers had done something far beyond a simple mistake. "Peterson, Hayes, stand at attention," Miller commanded, his voice firm and unyielding. "Report the situation immediately." Both officers flinched and tried to stand up straighter, but they were still visibly rattled. Peterson attempted to explain, but his words were jumbled and contradictory, full of excuses about the vague report and misunderstandings. Lieutenant Miller, however, wasn't easily deceived. He turned to Vance, who stood unervingly calm in the midst of the chaos. "Sir," Miller said with respect, sensing an air of authority around Vance, "I'm Lieutenant Miller, overseeing this area. It seems there's been an unfortunate incident. Could you tell me what happened?" Vance's voice remained steady, low, and controlled. He showed no signs of agitation or fear as he began speaking. "Lieutenant Miller," he began, "I am Elias Vance." He paused, allowing the name to sink in. "I was unjustly stopped based on a false report. I was subjected to insulting and discriminatory questions. When I asked for clarification and refused to answer inappropriate inquiries, they charged me with resisting arrest, used excessive force, and handcuffed me." Miller listened intently, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed Vance's words. The name, Elias Vance, rang a bell, but Miller hadn't immediately made the connection. Vance continued without hesitation. "I believe the actions of Officer Peterson and Officer Hayes were serious violations of my civil rights and of the police department's professional standards." He locked eyes with Miller. "And just so you're clear, Lieutenant, I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The revelation hit Miller like a bolt of lightning. He froze, his eyes darting between Vance and the two officers, now fully understanding the reason for their terror. He had heard of Elias Vance, the FBI director, but never imagined he would be facing him in such a situation. This was far beyond anything Miller had encountered in his career. Miller quickly regained his composure, his response swift and professional. Turning to Peterson and Hayes, his voice was sharp and commanding. "You two, surrender your weapons, badges, and radios immediately. You are suspended pending an investigation." He gestured toward the two officers with him. "These officers will escort you to the security office." Neither Peterson nor Hayes dared to resist. They silently obeyed, their faces filled with dread as they followed the orders. Their fates were sealed in that moment. Once Peterson and Hayes were escorted away, Lieutenant Miller turned to face Vance, his expression now serious and apologetic. "Director Vance," he began, his voice sincere, "on behalf of the Chicago Police Department, I would like to offer my deepest and most sincere apology for the completely unacceptable behavior of my officers. This was an extremely serious and shameful incident. We are committed to conducting a thorough, transparent investigation and will treat this matter with the utmost seriousness." Vance nodded slightly, accepting the apology, but his expression remained impassive. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your professionalism. I request that this incident be officially documented immediately. And most importantly, I ask that the body camera footage from both Officer Peterson and Officer Hayes be preserved unaltered. That footage will be key evidence." Miller quickly agreed, his voice firm. "Your request will be carried out, Mr. Director. We will cooperate fully with any investigation, including federal inquiries." The news of the shocking incident spread rapidly to the highest levels of the Chicago Police Department, the mayor's office, and, of course, the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice. The law enforcement community was rocked by the revelations. An investigation began at lightning speed, involving close coordination between the CPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, the DOJ's Civil Rights Unit, and the FBI. The body cam footage of Peterson and Hayes provided irrefutable evidence, exposing the entire sequence of events, from the vague report, the officer's racist and offensive words, to the escalating panic and apologies after realizing who Vance truly was. Further scrutiny revealed a troubling history of misconduct by Officer Peterson, including several previous complaints of abuse, power misuse, and discriminatory behavior. These incidents had often been dismissed or downplayed. While Officer Hayes wasn't as egregious, his lack of independent judgment and tendency to follow orders without question were concerning. The investigation expanded beyond just these two individuals, looking into broader systemic issues within the department, including whether there was a cover-up or tolerance of such behavior. The case involving the FBI director became a pivotal moment in exposing dark corners within law enforcement. The investigation concluded with both Peterson and Hayes being formally dismissed from the Chicago Police Department for severe violations of ethical standards, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. But the consequences didn't stop there. The U.S. Department of Justice decided to pursue federal charges against both officers under 18 U.S. Code Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. In addition, they could face charges under Illinois state law for assault and unlawful detention. The trial of Peterson and Hayes garnered significant public and media attention, becoming a high-profile test of law enforcement accountability and the fight against racism in the justice system. The courtroom in the Northern District of Illinois was tense as the case unfolded under the public's watchful eye. Peterson and Hayes sat at the defense table, looking older than their years. Their faces were drawn, their eyes filled with dread and regret. They were no longer the confident officers they had been at O'Hare Airport. On the prosecution side, the Justice Department's attorneys presented their case with sharp precision and conviction. They highlighted how the two defendants had acted out of racial prejudice, rather than relying on solid evidence, using their authority to humiliate, assault, and unlawfully detain a citizen. The full body cam footage was played for the court, clearly showing every word and action of Peterson and Hayes. The footage sparked murmurs and shocked expressions among the jury members and those watching the trial. The pivotal moment in the trial came with the testimony of FBI Director Elias Vance. He appeared in a formal suit, exuding calm professionalism as he took the stand. He recounted the entire incident in a measured and accurate manner, focusing on the civil rights violations he had endured. His demeanor was composed, free of anger or the desire for revenge. His clarity, poise, and credibility lent immense weight to his testimony. He was not just a victim. He stood as a figure of authority in law enforcement, testifying against those who had tainted the reputation of the profession. The defense did everything they could to minimize their client's actions. They argued that it was a regrettable mistake during a stressful workday, that the defendants acted on false information from the initial reports, and that they deeply regretted their behavior. They attempted to downplay the racial element, claiming it was just words spoken in the heat of the moment, not a reflection of their client's character. However, these arguments fell flat, easily refuted by the irrefutable evidence from the body cam footage and Vance's testimony. After several days of intense deliberation, the jury withdrew to discuss their verdict. The wait in the courtroom was thick with tension. Finally, the door to the deliberation room opened, and the 12 jurors returned to their seats, their faces unreadable. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict aloud. For the defendant, Gary Peterson, on the charge of civil rights violation under color of law, we, the jury, find guilty. For the charge of third-degree assault, we find guilty. Each guilty sounded like a hammer striking the fate of the two former officers. Both Peterson and Hayes were found guilty on all major charges. Peterson bowed his head to the table, his shoulders trembling. Hayes closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. Their fleeting hope for leniency had been shattered. Weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. The federal judge presiding over the case spoke with stern authority. She stressed the importance of the role police officers play in upholding justice and protecting the public, and the grave consequences of betraying their duty. She made it clear that racial discrimination wasn't just a personal affront. It was a direct threat to the foundation of a just society, undermining public trust in the legal system. The actions of the defendants, she said, looking directly at Peterson and Hayes, not only harmed the victim, but they also tarnished the reputation of countless other dedicated officers who put their lives on the line to serve the community. Discrimination is a disease that must be eradicated from law enforcement. After a series of stern remarks, the judge delivered her final verdict. Gary Peterson and Ryan Hayes are each sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. The sentence was a clear message that abuse of power and racial discrimination would not be tolerated, especially from those entrusted with the law. As the sentence was read, Peterson and Hayes collapsed, their careers and lives forever altered. They were escorted away by marshals, their futures sealed. Elias Vance, present at the hearing, watched silently. When the verdict was announced, he nodded slightly, not in gloating, but in quiet acknowledgement that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Vance's office at the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. Vance stood by the window, looking out over Pennsylvania Avenue, as traffic rushed below. Months had passed since the trial in Chicago, but the echoes of the incident still lingered in his mind. He felt neither joy nor triumph. Justice had been delivered, and the wrongdoers had been held accountable, but a heavy, complex feeling hung over him. He knew better than anyone that the reason his case had been resolved swiftly and thoroughly was largely because of his position as FBI director. His power and influence had acted as both a shield and a sword for justice. But what if he had been just an ordinary Elias Vance, a middle-aged black man traveling for work, well-dressed, but without the title and authority that came with his position? Would his concerns have been heard? Would the body cam footage have been given fair scrutiny? Would Peterson and Hayes have been fired, prosecuted, and sentenced as harshly? Or would the case have been brushed aside, dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, with only a token apology, if any? The answer he didn't want to admit, but couldn't ignore, was probably not. The O'Hare incident, though painful and humiliating, served as a stark reminder of a much broader systemic issue. Racism and abuse of power were still deeply embedded in the law enforcement system, despite his role at the top. His case was only the tip of the iceberg, with countless others, particularly people of color, enduring unfair treatment, unjust suspicion, and even violence without the protection or voice to fight back. He sighed, turning away from the window, and made his way to his desk, which was cluttered with papers. The responsibility weighing on him was immense, not only to lead the FBI in the fight against national security threats and organized crime, but to lead by example, to drive internal change, and to help create a law enforcement system that was truly fair, respected human rights, and rejected discrimination in all its forms. His personal case was over, but the larger battle continued. It would take perseverance, courage, and unshakable determination. Vance sat down at his desk, picked up a file, and began to work. His eyes were steady, focused. He knew his role in this ongoing fight was far from over, and he would continue to push for a future where no one, regardless of their race or status, would ever have to endure what he had. True justice, he believed, should not depend on who you are. "Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story," he would later say to the public. If you found this content meaningful, please like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next important story. Tomorrow, we have another story for you. Do you want to hear it?